The old windmill had not turned in 14 years. By the time the first blade groaned against the Kansas night sky, half the town of Mason Creek was already standing in the dirt road watching Clara Whitcomb make a fool of herself. The storm clouds rolling over the wheat fields looked almost black under the lightning, and the air smelled like dust, hot metal, and rain that still hadn't come. "Shut it down," one of the county men shouted over the wind. But Clara kept both hands wrapped around the rusted valve wheel near the base of the tower. Then the windmill gave another turn. A deep shudder moved through the ground beneath their boots. For one long second, nothing happened. Then muddy water exploded from the old pipe beside the cattle trough, hard enough to knock the lid clean into the fence posts. Nobody spoke. Not the engineers, not the deputies, not even the men who'd spent 6 months telling Clara Whitcomb there was nothing left under her land. Part 1 continued. After Hook, if you're watching from a small town, a farm road, or just somewhere that still believes old stories matter, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if stories like this still mean something to you, consider subscribing before we head back to the quiet morning when Clara Whitcomb still thought she had more time. 3 months before that night, Mason Creek looked like a town slowly being erased by dust. It sat in western Kansas, where the highway ran straight for miles and the wheat fields rolled low and gold under a sky too big for any person's troubles. There was a diner called Ruby's Corner, a feed store with faded red paint, one bank, one church with a bell that rang late in high wind, and a water tower that had been painted twice but still showed rust around the legs. Clara Whitcomb lived 6 miles outside town on Pine Hollow Road, though most people still called the place the Whitcomb Farm. Her husband, Ray, had been gone 4 years by then, buried beneath a cottonwood tree on the east side of the cemetery, where the wind never seemed to stop. Since his passing, Clara had kept the farm going with 2 cows, 12 laying hens, a garden that gave less every summer, and a stubbornness people mistook for pride. She was 63, thin from work. With silver hair she kept pinned behind her head and hands that looked older than the rest of her. Every morning before sunup, she walked the same path from the back porch to the old windmill beside the dry cattle trough. The tower leaned a little east. One blade was bent. Another had been missing since a hailstorm in 2009. The pump rod no longer moved, and the metal tail creaked whenever the breeze came down from the ridge. Most folks saw junk. Clara saw Ray's fingerprints on every bolt. He had spent his last good summer trying to fix it, standing on a ladder with a wrench in his back pocket, telling her the same thing he always said when she worried about the drought. "Water doesn't vanish, Clara. It just goes deeper than impatient people want to look." She used to laugh at that. After he died, she stopped laughing but kept the words. Inside the machine shed, nailed crooked above an old workbench, hung a hand-drawn map Ray had made years earlier. It showed fence lines, wells, the barn, the windmill, and a long dotted mark running under the south pasture. Clara had asked him once what it meant. Ray only smiled and said his father had told him not to trust county maps too much. That spring, Clara was behind on property taxes. The Northfield had failed 2 seasons in a row. Her son Daniel, who lived in Wichita and sold insurance, called every Sunday night and tried to sound gentle when he told her the same thing. "Mom, you can't keep bleeding money into dry ground." She never argued much. She only looked out the kitchen window at the windmill and said she would think about it. Then, on a Wednesday morning in May, a white county truck came rattling up her drive. Behind it was a clean black SUV with Prairie Meridian water printed on the door. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch. A young engineer climbed out first, carrying a tablet and wearing boots too new for Kansas dust. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he asked, "I'm Evan Mercer. We need to talk about the pipeline route." Clara looked past him toward the windmill. For the first time in years, the metal tail had turned by itself, pointing straight south. End Part 1. Part 2. Evan Mercer was polite in the careful way of a man who knew he had already won before the conversation started. He stood at the bottom of Clara's porch steps with a county folder tucked under one arm and his tablet glowing in the morning sun. Behind him, the black SUV idled beside the cattle guard. The county truck had 2 men inside, both wearing sunglasses, both pretending not to stare at the old windmill. "We're still in the survey phase," Evan said. "Nothing is final yet." Clara had lived long enough to know that when a man from the county said nothing was final, most of it already was. "What kind of pipeline?" she asked. "Water transfer line," Evan said. "Prairie Meridian is helping the county stabilize supply before summer demand peaks. The main route crosses the south pasture here, then follows the old section road into town." He turned the tablet so she could see a clean blue line drawn across her land. It cut right past the windmill, through the low place where Ray's dotted mark ran on the old shed map. Clara's eyes stayed on that line. "That ground isn't empty," she said. Evan glanced toward the pasture. Nothing moved there but dry grass and 2 blackbirds hopping along a fence wire. "With respect, ma'am, our records show no active structures in that section except the windmill tower. And that well was listed as dry in 1987. Records miss things." "They can," Evan said. "That's why we're here." He was not unkind. That almost made it worse. He spoke softly, explained clearly, and never once raised his voice. He told Clara the project could help Mason Creek through the drought. He told her the town's main wells were dropping faster than expected. He told her the county had authority to approve utility access if the route served public need. Then he looked up at the windmill. "That tower may have to come down." Clara felt something close around her ribs. The wind moved over the yard, carrying the smell of dust, sun-baked manure, and the faint sweetness of drying wheat. The windmill tail gave a slow metallic creak. "That windmill stays," she said. Evan looked at her for a moment, then nodded as if he had expected that. "I understand it has sentimental value." "It has more than that." He looked down at his tablet. "Mrs. Whitcomb, we ran ground scans from the road last week. There's no usable water source under this immediate site, just fractured limestone and some shallow voids. Nothing stable enough to matter." Clara folded her arms. "Did your scans go under the tower?" "Close enough." "That's not what I asked." For the first time, Evan did not answer right away. One of the county men climbed out of the truck. His name was Boyd Larkin, deputy assessor, a broad man with a red neck and a voice made for public meetings. "Clara," Boyd said, "nobody's trying to hurt you, but that windmill's a liability. Kids come out here. It falls. County gets blamed. Company removes it. You save demolition costs. Everybody wins." Everybody except the dead, Clara thought. Everybody except the people who had built things before permission slips and digital maps. She stepped down from the porch and walked past them into the yard. Evan followed, keeping a respectful distance. Boyd stayed near the truck. At the base of the windmill, Clara put one hand against the tower leg. The metal was warm already. Flakes of old silver paint came away on her palm. Evan crouched near the footing and moved a small handheld sensor over the ground. The device gave a low, uneven chirp. He frowned and tapped the screen. "What is it?" Clara asked. "Probably interference," he said. "From what?" He looked up at the tower, then toward the pasture. Old metal, buried wire, could be anything. Clara said nothing. As Evan stood, his boot scraped against a flat stone half buried in the dirt. He stepped aside, and Clara saw numbers carved into it beneath the dust. 1936. She bent slowly, brushed the stone with her thumb, and felt the grooves fill with sunlight. Evan saw it too. For the first time that morning, the young engineer looked less certain. End Part 2, Part 3. That evening, Clara stood in the machine shed with the door open and the sunset pouring through in long orange strips. The wind had gone quiet, leaving the farm in that uneasy silence that came before heat settled in for the night. Dust clung to the windows. A swallow moved in the rafters. Somewhere behind the barn, one of the hens fussed at nothing. Clara laid Ray's old map across the workbench and held the county route paper beside it. The blue line from Prairie Meridian ran almost exactly over Ray's dotted mark. She stared at the two papers until her eyes burned. Ray had drawn that map in pencil on brown feed store wrapping paper, the corners softened from years of being rolled and unrolled. He had written little notes in the margins, mostly things only he understood. North fence sagging, badger hole, old lime wash, south draw holds longer after rain. Near the windmill. He had drawn a circle with 3 short lines coming off it. Clara touched that circle with one finger. "What were you trying to tell me?" she whispered. For 4 years after Ray died, she had avoided looking too closely at the things he left behind. His work gloves still hung by the back door. His coffee cup, chipped along the rim, still sat in the cupboard where he had always reached for it. There were days she could move through the house like any ordinary woman, feeding hens, washing dishes, balancing bills. Then some small thing would catch her: the smell of old pipe tobacco in his jacket, the sound of a wrench falling in the shed, and the grief would come back fresh enough to take the strength out of her knees. She was still standing over the map when Daniel called. He always called after supper, when his own house in Wichita had gone quiet and he had time to worry about her. "Mom," he said, "Boyd Larkin called me." Clara closed her eyes. "He had no business doing that. He said Prairie Meridian made you an access offer." "They made the county an offer. I was just standing in the way." Daniel sighed, not angry yet. Tired first, angry usually came after. "This could help you. Compensation money, maybe enough to catch up the taxes, maybe enough to move into town before something happens out there." "Something already happened out here," Clara said. "What does that mean?" She looked at the map, at the dotted line under the south pasture. "Your father knew something about that windmill." "Dad believed a lot of things," Daniel said quietly. The words were not cruel, but they landed hard. Ray had spent his last year chasing old stories through drawers and county records, convinced the farm had a water system older than anyone remembered. Daniel had seen the unpaid bills, the failed repairs, the nights Ray came inside covered in dust with nothing to show for it. To him, the windmill was not a promise. It was where his father had spent the strength he had left. Clara's voice softened. "He wasn't a foolish man." "I know that," Daniel said, "but he was sick." "Mom." A silence stretched between them. Clara could hear Daniel's children laughing faintly in the background, her grandchildren, growing up with sidewalks and sprinklers, thinking of the farm as a place they visited at Thanksgiving. "I'm coming Saturday," Daniel said. "We need to talk about selling before the county forces your hand." After he hung up, Clara stayed by the bench for a long while. Then she opened the bottom drawer where Ray had kept odd things he never wanted thrown away. Inside were fence staples, yellowed receipts, a broken pocket knife, and a small tobacco tin. She lifted it out. Inside lay a brittle cement receipt dated August 1936, a folded sketch of the windmill base, and a short piece of green copper wire darkened with age. On the back of the sketch, in Ray's handwriting, were 4 words. Not a well, a vault. Clara sat down slowly on the wooden stool. Outside, the old windmill creaked once in the dark. End Part 3, Part 4. By Friday afternoon, the whole town seemed to know Clara Whitcomb was standing in the way of Mason Creek's water. That was not how anyone said it to her face. At Ruby's corner, the waitress still poured Clara's coffee before she asked. At Calhoun Feed and Grain, men still touched the brims of their caps when she walked in, but conversations softened when she came near. Eyes moved away too quickly. A town did not need to speak plain to make a person feel alone. The public meeting was held that evening in the basement of First Baptist because the county room was too small and the school gym had no air conditioning. Folding chairs filled the room. Farmers sat with their arms crossed. Mothers fanned sleeping children with church bulletins. Old men leaned against the back wall beneath framed photographs of potluck dinners and Christmas pageants. At the front stood Evan Mercer beside 2 men from Prairie Meridian Water and a projector screen showing maps in blue, green, and yellow. Clara sat in the 3rd row with Ray's folded map in her purse. She had nearly left it at home. It felt too private to carry into a room full of people who had already made up their minds. But when she reached for her house keys, she saw the paper on the kitchen table and remembered Ray's hands smoothing it flat under the shed light. So she brought it. Evan began with rainfall charts, reservoir levels, projected demand, and emergency supply routes. He did not talk down to people. He explained the problem clearly. Mason Creek's municipal wells were falling. If the summer stayed dry, restrictions would come by July. Stock tanks would need hauling. Gardens would die first, then lawns, then maybe small farms that depended on shallow wells. Nobody laughed then. Prairie Meridian's route, he said, was the fastest and least expensive option. It crossed mostly open land. Only one private structure stood in the main access zone. Clara felt half the room look at her. Boyd Larkin rose next and said the county had a responsibility to the whole community. He said fair compensation would be offered. He said progress sometimes required hard decisions. Then Clara stood. The scrape of her chair sounded louder than it should have. That structure isn't just a windmill, she said. A few people shifted. Someone coughed. Clara walked to the front with Ray's map in both hands. She unfolded it carefully on the table beside Evan's projector laptop. My husband believed there was a water vault beneath that tower. His father told him it was built during the Dust Bowl. There's a receipt from 1936. There's old pipe under the pasture. Your own sensor picked up interference near the base. Evan looked at the map. Clara could see he recognized the dotted line. Boyd gave a patient smile. Clara, with respect, a hand sketch isn't a county record. No, she said, but county records didn't build that farm. A murmur moved through the room. Near the back, a farmer named Pete Ralston gave a short laugh. Not loud, but enough. Come on, Clara, he said. If there was water out there, Ray would have found it. The words hit harder than Clara expected. For a moment, she saw Ray coming into the kitchen at dusk, shirt soaked through, face gray with sickness and disappointment. She had wanted him to stop. She had begged him to rest. Maybe Daniel was right. Maybe she had turned grief into proof because the alternative was letting Ray be wrong. Then an old voice rose from the left side of the room. Her people hauled limestone out there. Everyone turned. Walt Brenner, 82 years old and bent at the shoulders, sat with both hands resting on his cane. I was a boy, Walt said, but I remember Whitcomb wagons passing our place. White stone, cement sacks, pipe, summer of 36 or 37. My daddy said they were building something to outlast thirst. The basement went still. Boyd's smile faded. Evan looked from Walt to Clara's map, then back at the projected pipeline route. But Prairie Meridian's project manager closed his folder and stood. Memories are not engineering, he said, and we cannot delay emergency infrastructure over family folklore. By the end of the meeting, the county voted to approve the next survey stage. Clara walked home under a red evening sky with Ray's map pressed against her chest. At the edge of her driveway, fresh orange survey flags had already been pushed into the south pasture. End Part 4, Part 5. The first real heat wave arrived 2 days later. By noon, the air above the pasture shimmered hard enough to blur the fence posts, and the metal siding on the machine shed grew too hot to touch. Clara worked anyway. She had not slept much since the meeting. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw orange survey flags spreading across the pasture like warning markers before a funeral. So on Monday morning, before the sun fully cleared the wheat fields, she carried Ray's toolbox out to the windmill. The box was heavier than she remembered. Inside lay the same tools he had used for 30 years, crescent wrenches polished smooth by his hands, oil-stained rags, a socket set missing 3 pieces, and the long iron crank he once swore could persuade any stubborn machine in Kansas to cooperate. Clara climbed the service ladder slowly. The tower swayed in the wind more than she expected. Halfway up, her knees began to ache. By the top platform, her breathing had shortened enough that she needed both hands on the railing before she trusted herself to stand. Below her, the farm looked smaller than it once had. The garden, the rusted cattle panels, the faded barn roof she still could not afford to replace. And beyond it all, Dry land stretching mile after mile under a pale white sky. Clara removed the gearbox cover. Inside, the gears sat buried under years of dust, dead insects, and hardened grease thick as candle wax. One tooth on the main gear had cracked nearly clean through. She stared at it for a long moment. Ray must have known. That explained why he stopped trying to force the blades during his last summer. The tower had not failed all at once. It had been dying slowly while he was dying too. Clara wiped sweat from her face and reached for the oil can. "If you left me a secret," she muttered, "you could have at least left instructions." For the first hour, things almost seemed hopeful. The gears loosened. The tail shifted with the breeze. Once, the blades even creaked half a turn before sticking again. Then the west wind hit harder. The damaged gear slipped. A violent metallic crack exploded through the tower. The blade assembly jerked sideways so hard the whole structure shuddered beneath her boots. Clara lost her balance. One hand caught the railing, the other struck the gear housing. Pain shot through her wrist. For a terrible second, she saw open air beneath her and imagined herself falling through heat and dust all the way to the dry cattle trough below. But the tower steadied. Clara clung there, breathing hard while the bent blades groaned overhead. By the time she climbed down, her wrist had swollen and the front of her shirt was streaked black with grease. Daniel arrived less than an hour later. He came in a silver pickup wearing office shoes already coated in dust before he even reached the porch. The moment he saw the ladder beside the windmill, his face tightened. "Tell me you weren't up there." Clara said nothing. Daniel looked at her wrist. "Oh my God, Mom. It's just strained. You could have been killed." He followed her into the kitchen while she wrapped ice in a dish towel and held it against the swelling. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel looked out the window toward the windmill. "You're doing the same thing Dad did," he said quietly. Clara kept her eyes on the ice. He believed the tower mattered more than doctors, more than resting, more than us sometimes. "That's not true. He chased that thing until he couldn't breathe." The words hung between them like smoke. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. "I don't want to bury you next to him because of some old farm story." Clara's throat tightened. For the first time since Ray died, she almost said the words aloud. "Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is nothing under there except rust and grief and old men's promises." That night, after Daniel left angry and exhausted, Clara walked alone into the machine shed. The storm lantern hanging near the bench gave off weak yellow light. She sat heavily on the stool and looked at the cracked gear Ray never managed to replace. Then she heard it. Drip. Clara froze. Another drip echoed through the shed floor beneath her boots. Not rain. Not pipes. Water? Slow, deep, somewhere under the concrete. End part 5 and part 6. Clara did not move at first. The machine shed had made plenty of sounds in its lifetime. Mice in the grain sacks, wind pressing under the tin roof, old lumber settling after sundown. But this was different. Drip. It came again, soft and hollow, from beneath the floor near the back wall. Clara took the lantern from its hook and lowered it close to the concrete. The floor there was patched with old boards laid over a square section she had walked across 1,000 times without thinking. One board sat slightly higher than the others, its edge darkened by years of dust and oil. She knelt despite the pain in her wrist. With Ray's screwdriver, she pried at the first board. It groaned loose, then the second, then the third. Underneath was not dirt. It was a rusted iron ring set into a square wooden hatch. Clara sat back on her heels, heart beating so hard she could hear it. By morning, Walt Brenner was standing beside her in the shed with a flashlight in one hand and his cane in the other. "Well," he said softly, "I'll be." "You knew this was here." "No," Walt said, "but I knew your people didn't haul cement for nothing." The hatch took both of them and a crowbar to lift. When it finally opened, cool air breathed up from below, damp and mineral-rich, smelling of limestone, rust, and old rain. A narrow set of concrete steps led down into darkness. Clara wanted to go first, but Walt gave her a look. "You already tried to fall off one thing this week." He went down slowly, one step at a time. Clara followed with the lantern. At the bottom was a low chamber built from limestone blocks. Each fitted tighter than Clara expected from work nearly 90 years old. Along one wall ran a pipe as thick as her arm. Another pipe disappeared toward the south pasture. In the center sat a circular concrete basin, mostly dry except for a dark pool gathered in the bottom. From somewhere overhead, water dripped through a hairline crack. Drip, drip, drip. Clara stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. The pool was small, no wider than a washtub, but it reflected the lantern flame like black glass. Walt shined his flashlight along the wall. "There," he said. Scratched into the limestone were initials and a date. E.W.1936. Clara touched the letters. Elias Whitcomb, Ray's grandfather. Beside the initials was a rusted metal box sealed with a wire twist. The green copper wire looked almost exactly like the piece Clara had found in Ray's tobacco tin. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a little oilcloth packet, stiff with age. Walt helped unfold it carefully on the dry edge of the basin. It was a journal page. Not long, just a few lines in faded pencil. South vault holds runoff from ridge. Do not break pipe. Windmill opens upper valve only in southwest wind. If tower fails, water stays sealed. Clara read the words 3 times. Her eyes blurred before she finished. Ray had not imagined it. He had been looking in the right place, but the tower had failed before he could prove it. Walt removed his hat. For a while, neither of them spoke. Above them, a truck door slammed outside. Clara stiffened. They climbed back up as quickly as Walt's knees allowed. Through the shed doorway, Clara saw 2 Prairie Meridian trucks turning off Pine Hollow Road, followed by a flatbed hauling yellow digging equipment. Boyd Larkin stepped out first. Behind him, Evan Mercer looked at the windmill, then at Clara, then at the open hatch in the shed floor. Boyd called across the yard. "Survey crews starting early. Best stay clear of the south pasture." Clara stood in the shed doorway with the journal page folded in her good hand. The machines had arrived before sunrise. End Part 6 and Part 7. Clara stepped out of the shed before Walt could stop her. The morning light was thin and gray, not yet warm enough to soften the chill left from the night. Dust hung low over the pasture as the flatbed rolled to a stop near the orange survey flags. The yellow digging machine sat chained on the trailer like some crouched animal waiting to be turned loose. Boyd Larkin walked toward her with a clipboard. "Clara," he said, "this is county-approved survey work. Nobody's digging a trench today, just test cuts." "Not on that line." Boyd's jaw tightened. "We went through this at the meeting." "No," she said, holding up the folded journal page. "You talked over it at the meeting." Evan Mercer stood a few steps behind Boyd. His eyes kept moving from the open shed door to the windmill, then down to the paper in Clara's hand. "What is that?" he asked. "Proof your scan missed something." Boyd gave a tired breath. "An old note is not proof." "Then look under my shed." The project manager from Prairie Meridian climbed out of the second truck. His name was Graham Voss, a narrow man in a pressed shirt who looked irritated by the dust settling on his sleeves. "We cannot keep delaying a public water project every time a landowner produces a family keepsake," Graham said. Clara looked at him, then at the flatbed. For 1 second, fear moved through her so sharply she nearly stepped back. These men had papers, equipment, county approval, and money. She had one swollen wrist, an old journal page, and a tower that could not turn. Then she thought of Ray coming home with dust on his shoulders, too tired to eat, but still unwilling to say he had been wrong. Clara walked to her old blue pickup parked near the barn. "Mom." Daniel's voice came from the driveway. He had arrived without her hearing him. His shirt was wrinkled from the drive, his face pale with worry and anger. "Don't," he said, because he knew her well enough to see what she was about to do. Clara climbed into the pickup, started it, and drove straight across the yard. The engine knocked twice before catching, then growled over the dry ground. She stopped sideways in front of the flatbed ramp, blocking the digging machine from coming down. Boyd threw up one hand. "Clara, this is not helping you." She rolled down the window. "I'll move when you give me one day." One day for what Graham asked. To open the vault, repair the windmill, and run your test where the interference showed. Graham laughed once, sharp and humorless. Repair that in one day. Clara did not answer. Daniel walked to the truck window. His voice dropped low. "You can't fight them like this." "I'm not fighting them," she said. "I'm asking them to look." He stared at her for a long moment, and something in his face changed. Not belief exactly. Not yet. But the anger lost its edge. Evan stepped closer to Graham. "If there's an undocumented structure under the root, we need to verify it before cutting," he said. Graham turned on him. "You're the engineer who cleared the preliminary route. And I'm the engineer who will have to sign off if we damage a subsurface water structure we were warned about." That stopped the yard cold. Boyd looked from Evan to Graham, then at the pickup blocking the ramp. Finally, Graham said, 24 hours, no more, and if there's nothing, the machine rolls tomorrow." Clara nodded once, but parts cost money she did not have. By noon, she was standing inside Harper & Son Salvage 15 miles away, laying her wedding ring on the counter beside the cracked gear from the windmill. The owner, Earl Harper, stared at the ring. "Clara, I can't take that." "You can," she said. "And you will, if you've got a gear that fits." Earl looked at the gold band, then at the gear, then toward the dusty shelves behind him. When Clara walked out an hour later, her left hand felt strangely light. On the passenger seat sat a wrapped bundle of old steel parts. And back at the farm, Evan Mercer was standing alone beside the windmill, studying his tablet with a look Clara had not seen before. Doubt. End Part 7, Part 8. The repair began in the kind of heat that made every tool burn the hand that held it. Clara, Daniel, Walt, and Evan stood beneath the windmill while the morning stretched bright and merciless over the Whitcomb farm. The flatbed still sat by the pasture road, its digging machine chained in place, waiting like a threat with yellow teeth. Graham Voss had left 2 workers behind to watch the property line. Boyd Larkin came and went in his county truck, pretending he was only checking procedure. By 10 o'clock, word had spread through Mason Creek that Clara Whitcomb had blocked a county crew with her pickup and traded her wedding ring for windmill parts. People began slowing down on Pine Hollow Road. Some stopped altogether. Pete Ralston parked near the ditch and leaned against his truck with his arms folded. A few women from First Baptist arrived with lemonade and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Ruby from the diner brought a paper bag of biscuits and set it on Clara's porch without saying anything. Nobody quite admitted they were there to watch her fail. But nobody drove away either. Daniel climbed the tower first. Clara hated letting him do it. Every rung he climbed made her wrist ache, as if her own body remembered the fall that had almost happened. But Daniel had stronger hands and younger knees, and for once he did not ask her to stop. Evan stood below with the old sketch from Ray's tobacco tin and the sensor report on his tablet. "These void readings," he said, mostly to himself, "aren't random. They line up with the dotted mark." Clara looked at him. "You said close enough." Evan's face tightened. "I was wrong to say that. It was not an apology big enough to fix anything, but it was honest." Clara accepted it by saying nothing. Walt sat on an overturned bucket near the shed door, reading the journal page again and again through his thick glasses. "Southwest wind," he murmured. Elias was particular about that. By noon, Daniel had the broken gear out. Earl Harper's replacement fit, but not cleanly. One edge had to be filed down by hand. The bolt holes were off just enough to make every adjustment slow and maddening. Clara stood at the workbench, filing steel with her good hand while sweat ran down her neck. Her wedding ring was gone. She kept feeling for it with her thumb and finding only the pale groove it had left behind after 42 years. Each time, her chest tightened, but she did not stop filing. By late afternoon, they had the gear mounted. Daniel climbed down covered in grease. Evan checked the pump rod. Clara opened the hatch and made sure the old valve wheel in the vault could turn. It fought her at first, then moved with a low grinding sound that echoed through the limestone chamber. Above ground, the windmill blade sat still. Not slow, not weak. Still, the air had gone dead. The crowd along the road grew quiet as the sun dropped low and red over the fields. Evan looked at the weather app on his tablet, then at the sky. "No wind until tomorrow afternoon," he said. "Graham Voss returned just before sunset." He glanced at the motionless tower and gave a small nod, as if the farm itself had made his argument for him. "Time's up at 7 in the morning," he said. Clara looked at the windmill. Daniel wiped grease from his hands with an old rag and stood beside her. For the first time all day, she looked truly tired. That night, she did not sleep in the house. She sat in a lawn chair near the base of the tower with Ray's map folded in her lap and the empty place on her finger catching moonlight. Near midnight, dust began tapping against the tin roof of the shed. Then the first cool breath of wind came sliding out of the southwest. End Part 8, Part 9. By dawn, the sky over Mason Creek had turned the color of old tin. Dust rolled low across the wheat stubble, crossing the pasture in thin brown sheets that curled around the survey flags and snapped them hard against their wires. The southwest wind had strengthened before sunrise, steady enough now to push against the house and make the screen door tremble in its frame. Clara was already at the windmill. She had not slept. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and the sleeve of Ray's old workshirt was buttoned wrong at the wrist. But she stood with both feet planted in the dirt, one hand resting on the valve wheel at the base of the tower. Daniel stood beside her. So did Walt, leaning on his cane. Evan Mercer arrived at 6:30 with his tablet, his sensor, and a face that looked as if he had spent the whole night reading every report twice. Boyd Larkin came behind him, then Graham Voss, then Pete Ralston, then half the people who had watched from the road the day before. Nobody had planned a gathering. Still, the road filled with trucks. Graham checked his watch. 7 o'clock, he said. "We've honored the delay." Clara looked up. The windmill tail swung slowly, then caught. For a second, the blades only quivered. Then one blade moved. A groan rose from the tower, deep and rusty, like something waking with pain in its bones. The blades turned once, stopped, then turned again. Daniel held his breath. Evan lifted his sensor toward the base. The third turn came faster. Metal clanked. The pump rod dropped, lifted, dropped again. From inside the shed, through the open hatch, came the low grinding echo of old machinery answering from underground. Clara turned the valve wheel. It resisted. She tightened her grip with both hands, pain flashing through her swollen wrist. Daniel reached to help, but she shook her head once. This part was hers. The wheel broke free with a scream of rust. For a moment, nothing happened. Only wind. Only dust. Only the terrible watching silence of people waiting to be right. Then the pipe beside the old cattle trough coughed. A dry, hollow cough. Pete Ralston lowered his arms. The pipe spat a mouthful of red mud, then went still. Graham exhaled through his nose. "Mrs. Whitcomb." The ground shuddered. Not loud, not dramatic, just a deep tremble beneath their boots, the kind a person felt before they understood it. The pipe coughed again. This time, the mud came harder, splashing against the cracked trough, dark and thick. Then came air, then another burst of mud. Then water. It surged out brown at first, carrying sand and rust and 90 years of silence. It struck the trough with such force that the loose metal lid flew off and clattered into the fence posts. Someone gasped. The windmill kept turning. The stream cleared by degrees. from brown to amber to a cold, bright silver that caught the morning light like glass. Clara did not smile. She only stood there with one hand on the valve wheel and the other pressed against the tower leg, as if she were feeling the pulse of something alive. Evan walked to the trough, knelt, and placed his hand under the running water. He looked back at Graham. "There's an active storage system under this site," he said, "and if we cut through that south line, we may destroy it." Graham's face had gone pale beneath the dust. Boyd removed his sunglasses. Walt whispered, "Elias, you old fox." Nobody laughed. Not this time. Clara heard the water, the wind, the turning blades, and somewhere inside all of it, she almost heard Ray breathing after a long climb home. Then the world tilted. Daniel caught her before she hit the ground. The last thing Clara saw was the windmill turning against the storm-colored sky, and the people of Mason Creek standing silent around the water they had sworn was not there. End Part 9, Part 10. Clara woke in her own bed with the curtains moving beside an open window. For a moment, she did not know what day it was. The room smelled faintly of rain dust, camphor salve, and coffee from the kitchen. Her wrist had been wrapped tighter than before. Her boots were gone. So was Ray's old shirt. Then she heard the windmill. Not loud. Just a slow, steady creak turning somewhere beyond the house. Daniel was sitting in the chair beside her bed, elbows on his knees, hands folded like he had been praying and did not want anyone to know. "You scared me," he said. Clara looked toward the window. "Is it still running?" Daniel laughed once, but his eyes were wet. "Yeah," he said, "it's still running." By noon, the county had blocked off the pasture road. Evan Mercer and 2 state water inspectors went down into the vault with helmets, flashlights, and measuring equipment. They stayed below for nearly an hour. When they came back up, Evan's shirt was marked with limestone dust, and his face carried the look of a man who had found the truth and knew it would cost somebody. The old system was real. A stone-lined runoff vault, buried pipe, an upper valve controlled by the windmill, and a south line that ran directly beneath Prairie Meridian's proposed route. Cutting through it would not only destroy Clara's structure, it could collapse a hidden water storage system that had been quietly collecting ridge runoff for generations. The county suspended the pipeline route that afternoon. Not canceled, suspended. That was how government men said they had been wrong without saying it too plainly. Graham Voss did not apologize in front of the crowd. He shook Clara's hand on the porch, stiffly, and said Prairie Meridian would reevaluate the corridor. Evan apologized later, when no one was close enough to hear. "I trusted the clean version of the map," he said. Clara looked out toward the windmill. "Most people do." Within a week, Mason Creek changed in small ways. Pete Ralston came by with a new trough lid he claimed he had no use for. Ruby brought chicken soup twice. Boyd Larkin delivered copies of the emergency preservation order himself, standing awkwardly on the porch like a boy sent to return something he had broken. The taxes were still due. The barn roof still leaked near the west corner. Clara's wrist hurt whenever the weather shifted, and every morning her thumb found the empty place where her wedding ring had been. Earl Harper kept it in a small envelope under his counter. He told Clara she could buy it back whenever she was ready. She did not know when that would be. Daniel stayed through the end of the month. He fixed the porch step, patched the chicken wire, and helped Evan install a safer cover over the vault hatch. He did not promise to move back. Clara did not ask him to. On his last morning, he stood beside her at the windmill while water ran clear into the trough. "I thought Dad wasted himself chasing this," he said. Clara watched the blades turn slowly against the pale Kansas sky. "Maybe he did," she said. "Maybe he also left us enough to find our way back." Daniel nodded, but said nothing. The Whitcomb farm did not become famous. It did not become easy. The wind still carried dust. The bills still came in white envelopes. Some summers would still be hard. But the windmill stayed. And on quiet evenings, when the sun dropped behind the wheat and the tower threw its long shadow across the yard, Clara would stand at the kitchen sink and listen to that old metal turning. Not like a miracle. Like work. Like memory. like something stubborn enough to keep giving? End part 10. Sometimes the most valuable things in life are the things the world tells us are useless. An old windmill, a worn-out farm, a promise made by someone who's no longer here. We live in a time where people are taught to move fast, throw things away, and trust only what can be measured on a screen. But stories like Clara's remind us that wisdom is often buried beneath years of dust, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. The people who came before us understood something important. Land remembers, families remember, and hard times have a way of revealing what truly matters. Maybe you've got something in your own life that others gave up on: a dream, a family tradition, a piece of land, an old machine, or even a part of yourself. Before you walk away from it, take one more look. Sometimes hope survives in quiet places. And if this story meant something to you, we'd truly love to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your town right now. Have you ever known someone like Clara, someone stubborn enough to keep believing when nobody else did? Share your story down in the comments. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about rural America, old wisdom, family farm, and quiet people proving the world wrong, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next story.